We have a challenge today. Actually, lots of challenges. But one specifically when it comes to Rosh Hashanah. Tomorrow morning we will read from the Torah. And the verses we read will contain a story that is more than just a little problematic. Cantor will chant the Akedah, in which we're told that Abraham is being tested by God, who has commanded him to sacrifice his son. We're told that Abraham listened. He set off with Isaac and 2 of his servants to complete that task. None of us can imagine ever sacrificing a human life, let alone our own child. It's unfathomable. And yet, every year, Jews around the world will open our Torah scrolls and repeat these verses. Do we read this story to remember the sacrifices that our ancestors were willing to make? Or to demonstrate what true faith to God must look like? Or even, as the text implies, that we have to prove our fear of God? We're told that everything in the Torah has meaning. Every letter, every word, every story. That they're there to teach us something. The same must be true of this story. So as we read it this year, I want you to think of it a little differently. Later in the Torah, when we're given laws to follow, we know that they didn't come out of thin air. If it says don't, we know people were doing them. Don't murder, don't steal. People needed to be told what was wrong. And if it says do, like setting up a justice system that is fair, then we know that they weren't. These laws are there because people were acting in a way that needed to be corrected. The same must be true for this story. This isn't simply about Abraham's faith. It's about teaching us to distinguish ourselves from our neighbors through a set of laws. You see, we know that other nations would sacrifice their children. We have accounts in the Bible describing the Canaanite worshipers of Moloch throwing children into fires. The Akedah was to teach us we don't do this. We are to set ourselves apart and act differently than the people around us. We are to have higher standards by which we hold ourselves accountable. And that's the lesson. Because every year at this time, we're supposed to think of our actions and do a cheshbon hanefesh, an accounting of our soul. We are to think about our family, our community, the state of our nation and our world, where we are and what's happening. It's been a hard year. Coronavirus and quarantines, racism and remote-only connections, flaming forest fires and funnels of hurricanes, disputes about science, and debates on politics. I think of a recent bar mitzvah who was worried that his father was talking politics with us rabbis. As they entered the parking lot, the bar mitzvah boy said privately to his father, "Dad, you can't tell them who we're voting for. They might not like us anymore." These challenges have divided us. They've divided our communities, even our homes. We don't allow for disagreement. Instead of thinking someone's idea is wrong, we switch and think something is wrong with that person. Tonight we ask ourselves, how do we get out of this slump? How do we lift ourselves up? How do we maintain or mend those relationships? The answer is from our Rosh Hashanah Torah portion. Just as we learned from the Akedah, we have to act differently. There's a story from a local school guidance counselor who I think gives us the first step. Last winter, there was a teacher who was annoyed by a family. Every day, one of her students would come to school with buttons missing. Shirt buttons, pants buttons, coat buttons. I know they have the means. Why can't these parents send him to school looking neat and clean? Meanwhile, back at home, the child's parents, too, were quite annoyed. Every day, they would see their son getting off the bus looking a little disheveled. And upon closer inspection, they would notice buttons were missing from his clothes. What on earth did they do in that kindergarten? Why can't they send our son home looking neat and clean? The third perspective, the child's, learned by the guidance counselor after hearing complaints from both the parents and the teacher. On the bus ride home, when no one was looking, the boy amused himself by plucking off the buttons. Why? Because he got to sit with his parents as they sewed the new buttons back on. He just wanted to sit with his parents. It was as simple as that. We have a tendency to be like those parents and the teacher. We're quick to react, make assumptions, and to judge others. We blame, discredit, put words in others' mouths, which they never said, and then look down upon them. At a conference in early March, speaking to a group of rabbis, Lisa Eisen, the co-president of the Schusterman Family Foundation, posed a question that I want to share with you, because I believe that question, if adhered to, will distinguish us and will help us begin to move in the right direction this year. The question she asked: what would it look like if we exchanged judgment with curiosity? Think about it for yourself. What would it look like if we exchanged judgment with curiosity? We all have times when we've wrongly judged someone and put up walls. I remember earlier this summer when my wife Ilana and I took the kids on a trip around Lake Michigan. We were on the border of the UP and Wisconsin and pulled into a gas station. The plan was to fill up the car and make a pit stop, so we got the kids out of the car. A woman pulled up to the pump behind us and got out of her car. "Can I buy your kids a candy bar?" I was a little taken aback. It's not every day when a stranger asks to buy my kids something. I could say that it was because of COVID that I politely declined, as we were doing our best to avoid contact with others. But truth is, I made assumptions about her. Her appearance led me to believe that she needed the money more than our kids needed a candy bar. And I assumed that she had motives too. Was this her hook to talk politics? Was she going to buy the kids something and then begin to testify and talk about religion? I replied to her questions with short answers. But then, knowing that we would be leaving soon, I started to ask her questions. Turned out that almost 30 years ago, one of her children was kidnapped. The neighbor who was responsible was later caught, and her daughter's body was recovered. Since then, as a way of remembering her daughter, she buys small treats for kids with their parents. Because I moved from judgment to curiosity, I had a powerful conversation with this woman, and her story has stuck with me, all of which I would have missed if I had continued to try to avoid her. What would it look like if you exchanged judgment with curiosity? Instead of assuming the worst and distancing yourself from someone, it would force you to ask questions and engage in conversation. And that discussion could lead to getting to know someone, where they're coming from. You'd gain insight into their line of thinking and may even gain an appreciation for how they reach their conclusion. Doesn't mean that you'll always agree with that person. You may disagree. You may disagree often. But instead of immediately judging them and making assumptions and distancing yourself, you may be drawn closer through your discussion. And learning by asking questions, it's a very Jewish thing to do. More than observing Jewish law, or eating traditional Jewish foods, or even being a part of a Jewish community, the majority of Jews in the United States, in a survey a few years ago, believed that intellectual curiosity was essential to being Jewish, that it made us distinct as a people. We're told on this day that God opens the Sefer Chaim, the book of life, and judges each one of us. Let's leave the judging to God. The rest of us have an obligation to be curious, to have conversations and learn from each other, to learn about experiences that shape our identity and the way that we see our world. As we celebrate this new year, may it be one filled with many questions. And may those questions help strengthen our relationship and bring us closer to one another. Amen and amen.